Jimmy Carter funeral live. Mike Pence's wife Karen refuses to shake Trump's hand at National Cathedral. Mike Pence's wife Karen declined to shake Donald Trump's hand at the state funeral for former President Jimmy Carter in Washington, D.C. It was the first time Trump and his former vice president had spoken together in person since leaving office in the wake of a volcanic falling out over the events of January 6, 2021. Mike Pence did shake Trump's hand and they exchanged a few words. But his wife Karen snubbed the president-elect. President Joe Biden will deliver a eulogy the service, which is also being attended by Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. Carter, the 39th president, passed away at his home in Plains on December 29 at the age of 100 following a decorated life inside and outside of politics. For the National Day of Mourning, the post office and federal agencies will be shut as dignitaries gather in the Capitol to pay their respects. Michelle Obama skips Jimmy Carter's funeral and remains in Hawaii. Former First Lady Michelle Obama was conspicuously absent from former President Jimmy Carter's funeral on Thursday. Mrs. Obama did not appear with her husband, former President Barack Obama, despite other former First Ladies making the trip to the Washington National Cathedral to pay their respects. CNN reported that Obama had scheduling conflicts. "I'm told by her advisors that she has scheduling conflicts," CNN reporter Jeff Zeleny said on the network. She's still in Hawaii. By skipping the funeral, Michelle appears to have avoided another encounter with Trump. Barack Obama was seated next to President-elect Donald Trump for the ceremony. Karen Pence refuses to shake Trump and Melania's hand. Mike Pence's wife Karen snubbed Donald and Melania Trump as the president-elect arrived for the state funeral for former President Jimmy Carter at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. The relationship between Trump and his former vice president ruptured over the events of January 6, 2021. Mike Pence did get up and shake Trump's hand as he passed by. However, Karen Pence remained seated in her pew and looked the other way. She also refused to grab Melania's outstretched hand in another major snub. She held on to the funeral program and kept looking down. Martin Torrijos, a foreign Panamanian president with a special connection to Carter, was spotted inside the cathedral. Carter's memorial service comes days after Donald Trump once again blasted his administration for putting in place the return of the Panama Canal, calling it a disgrace and a terrible thing to do. It was Torrijos' father, former dictator Omar Torrijos, who pushed for the return of the canal during Carter's administration. The younger Torrijos stressed the canal during his 2004 to 2009 tenure. Al Gore attends President Carter's funeral. Former Vice President Al Gore mingles with fellow former VPs Mike Pence and Dan Quayle as he arrives for the funeral of late President Jimmy Carter at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. The two presidents were seen smiling while engaging in an animated conversation while they waited for Carter's funeral service to begin. All eyes are on the front rows at the funeral for former President Jimmy Carter, where political rivals are all seated within a few feet of each other. Front row, from left, President Biden, First Lady Jill Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff. Second row, from left, former President Bill Clinton, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, former President George W. Bush, former First Lady Laura Bush, former President Barack Obama, President-elect Trump, former First Lady Melania Trump. For a few minutes, Obama and Trump were seen leaning in for a conversation. Obama then turned around and was speaking with Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence and former Second Lady Karen Pence. When she entered, Harris did not acknowledge Trump seated just over her left shoulder. Just 3 days after resigning as Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau attended the funeral of late President Jimmy Carter. The outgoing PM was seen mingling and taking a seat at National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. on Thursday. This is the first time Trudeau will be in the same room with President-elect Donald Trump since announcing he is stepping down as Canada's leader. Trump is largely credited with the reason Trudeau will no longer serve as PM. Canada's Liberal Party disagreed with Trudeau on how to handle Trump in his incoming second term. And the president-elect showed increased resentment for Trudeau, calling him governor several times after suggesting Canada become the 51st U.S. state if they couldn't handle his proposal for 25% tariffs. Justin Trudeau resigned as Prime Minister of Canada on Monday in remarks from his Rideau Cottage residence in Ottawa, Canada. Donald Trump arrived on Capitol Hill on Wednesday with wife Melania for meetings with Republicans and to pay their respects to Jimmy Carter. The 78-year-old president-elect said it was great to be back in Congress before heading into the Capitol Rotunda and for talks with the GOP. Trump is in Washington, D.C. to pay respects to mourn the late President Carter at his funeral on Thursday. Former Vice President Mike Pence is in attendance at former President Jimmy Carter's funeral. It is a rare moment where Pence is in the same room as President-elect Trump. The pair have not been seen together since they clashed over certifying the 2020 election, and the former vice president defied his old boss. Pence was spotted speaking with fellow former Vice Presidents Al Gore and Quayle. President Joe Biden is giving a eulogy at Jimmy Carter's funeral. Additionally, the eulogies written by former President Gerald Ford and former Vice President Walter Mondale before their own deaths will be read by their sons, Stephen Ford and Ted Mondale. Carter replaced Ford in the White House, defeating him in the 1976 election. But the two men struck up a friendship in their post-presidential years. Mondale served as Carter's vice president. Are banks open today? What is closed for Jimmy Carter's funeral? By Caitlin Corral, senior U.S. political reporter. The U.S. Postal Services are not operating on Thursday to observe a national day of mourning for President Jimmy Carter. President Joe Biden declared in an executive order issued on December 30 the closure of federal offices on Thursday, January 9. The day is observed much like a federal holiday for government workers. All American flags have also been ordered to be lowered at half-staff for the entirety of the day. Carter's casket is being transferred from the Capitol to Washington, D.C.'s National Cathedral for his funeral. Here's what's closed and what's open on Thursday. U.S. post offices closed. Mail and packages will not be delivered on January 9 through USPS. Federal offices and agencies, most are closed, though some workers are deemed as vital and still are required to perform their duties. Supreme Court closed. Chief Justice John Roberts ordered the High Court's building to be shut down on Thursday in recognition of the National Day of Mourning. Stock markets closed. The New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ closed trading of all U.S. equities and options. Banks open. National days of mourning do not require businesses or banks to close like a federal holiday normally does. It's advised, however, that Americans reach out to their local banks to make sure they are operating normally. National parks open. National parks and their visitor services will generally be open and available on Thursday. The National Park Services Administration offices, however, are closed. 9 a.m. Carter's casket departs the U.S. Capitol. The funeral motorcade travels to Washington National Cathedral. 9:30 a.m. Carter's motorcade arrives at Washington National Cathedral. 10 a.m. The Washington funeral begins. Expected speakers include Steve Ford, reading remarks written by his father, former President Gerald Ford before his death. Ted Mondale, reading remarks from his father, former Vice President Walter Mondale before his death. Former Carter advisor Stu Eisenstadt. Jason Carter, one of Jimmy Carter's sons, and President Joe Biden. 11:15 a.m. Carter's remains and his family depart the cathedral for Joint Base Andrews. 11:45 a.m. They board Special Air Mission 39, the plane that serves as Air Force One when the sitting president is on board. 2 p.m. Special Air Mission 39 arrives at Lawson Army Airfield at Fort Moore, Georgia. Carter's remains will be transferred to the hearse. Carter and his family then travel to Plains by motorcade. 3:30 p.m. Motorcade arrives at Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains. 3:45 p.m. An invitation-only funeral at the church begins. 4:45 p.m. A motorcade takes participants from the church to the Carter residence. 5:20 p.m. A U.S. Navy missing man formation conducts a flyover in honor of Carter's naval service and time as Commander-in-Chief, followed by a private graveside ceremony and interment. Biden reveals how Jimmy Carter asked him to perform his eulogy. President Joe Biden will deliver the eulogy for his fellow Democrat at the Episcopal Church that has been a traditional venue for send-offs of U.S. presidents, from Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan to George H.W. Bush. Biden revealed in an interview with USA Today published Wednesday that Carter had asked him to do the honors when the pair, long-standing friends, met for the last time 4 years ago. Carter was a decent man. I think Carter looked at the world not from here but from here, where everybody else lives, Biden said as he gestured from above his head towards his heart. Donald Trump arrived on Capitol Hill on Wednesday with wife Melania for meetings with Republicans and to pay their respects to Jimmy Carter. The 78-year-old president-elect said it was great to be back in Congress before heading into the Capitol Rotunda and for talks with the GOP. Trump is in Washington, D.C. to pay respects to mourn the late President Carter at his funeral on Thursday. The 78-year-old president-elect said it was great to be back in Congress before heading in for talks. Last month, President Joe Biden broke from his family vacation in the U.S. Virgin Islands to remember Jimmy Carter, recalling his predecessor as a role model and friend whom he described as a remarkable leader. President Joe Biden will deliver a eulogy for Jimmy Carter today, watched on by 4 other presidents who have served in the White House. Let's take a look back at how each of them paid tribute to the 39th president to sit in the Oval Office. Elected in the shadow of Watergate, Jimmy Carter promised voters that he would always tell the truth. And he did, advocating for the public good, consequences be damned. He believed some things were more important than re-election, things like integrity, respect, and compassion. Because Jimmy Carter believed, as deeply as he believed anything, that we are all created in God's image. Whenever I had a chance to spend time with President Carter, it was clear that he didn't just profess these values. He embodied them. And in doing so, he taught all of us what it means to live a life of grace, dignity, justice, and service. Donald Trump arrived on Capitol Hill on Wednesday with wife Melania for meetings with Republicans and to pay their respects to Jimmy Carter. The 78-year-old president-elect said it was great to be back in Congress before heading into the Capitol Rotunda and for talks with the GOP. Trump is in Washington, D.C. to pay respects to mourn the late President Carter at his funeral on Thursday. In just 12 days, he will take the oath of office on the steps outside the building and be sworn in, capping off a historic political comeback. The incoming first couple walked into the Capitol Rotunda and stood by his casket for a moment of silence. Watch the video below and read the story by John Michael Roche here. Mandy Moore and Kerry Washington, pictured, led the celebrity tributes to Jimmy Carter after his death was announced. Moore, 40, took to her Instagram stories sharing an image of the former president, whom she called an exemplary human and humanitarian, while Washington, 47, reposted an announcement of Carter's death from the New York Times to her Instagram. Piers Morgan also shared a touching tribute, posting a photo of him and Carter on X, formerly known as Twitter. R.I.P. President Jimmy Carter, 100. A remarkable person who was the epitome of the phrase, public service. I had the honor of interviewing him 3 times, and he was one of the wisest, smartest, most compassionate, modest, and human world leaders I've ever met. A great man. In November, Jimmy Carter made history once again when he became the oldest person ever nominated for a Grammy. The 100-year-old is up for the award of Best Audiobook, Narration, and Storytelling Recording when the awards are held next month in Los Angeles. Also nominated in his category are Dolly Parton and Barbra Streisand. Carter's album Last Sundays in Plains, a Centennial Celebration, is a compilation of Carter's final Sunday school lessons at Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia, where he was a popular teacher for decades. Each of the lessons is accompanied by an acclaimed musician, including John Batiste, Kebemo, Leanne Rimes, and Darius Rucker. Carter has previously won 3 Grammys in the same category. He won in 2007, 2016, and in 2019, and holds the most Grammy Awards by a president, with Barack Obama and Bill Clinton winning twice each. Read the full story by DailyMail.com showbiz reporter Elysia Stanford. As one of the world's most distinguished statesmen, Jimmy Carter was used to the company of the world's most powerful figures. Here are some photographs looking back at some of his most memorable encounters, from meeting the late Queen of the United Kingdom to Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. Laura and I send our heartfelt condolences to Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and the entire Carter family. James Earl Carter, Jr. was a man of deeply held convictions. He was loyal to his family, his community, and his country. President Carter dignified the office, and his efforts to leave behind a better world didn't end with the presidency. His work with Habitat for Humanity and the Carter Center set an example of service that will inspire Americans for generations. Jimmy Carter was described by then British Prime Minister James Callaghan as a breath of fresh air to the Western world when the U.S. president visited in 1977. During his trip to the UK, Carter gave a speech in Newcastle, North East England, where he endeared himself to the locals by uttering the local phrase, "Ho away the lads." The local newspaper, The Chronicle, reported at the time. His presidency lasted just 4 years, but Jimmy Carter, who has died aged 100, is still remembered for committing one of the biggest breaches of royal protocol ever. During a stay at Buckingham Palace ahead of a G7 visit in May 1977, having been invited by Queen Elizabeth II, President Carter kissed the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, on the lips by way of greeting. The Queen Mother, who died in March 2002, was not amused by Georgia-born and bred Carter's Southern hospitality. No images of the offending moment were captured, but the Queen Mother later wrote about the unpleasant encounter, noting how she had seen Carter leaning in for a kiss and had unsuccessfully tried to dodge him. "Nobody has done that since my husband died," she later said. "I took a sharp step backwards, not quite far enough." The Queen Mother's husband, King George VI, died in 1952, meaning Carter had been the first man to kiss her on the lips in 25 years. He was also likely the last. To the world, Jimmy Carter was known as the 39th U.S. President, a humanitarian and Nobel Peace Prize winner, but to his grandson Hugo Wenzel, Carter was simply Papa. In an interview with DailyMail.com, Wenzel, a bodybuilder, shared new details about his final days and reflected on his inspirational life. The 25-year-old said that his grandfather could not move around or really speak in the end, but he believes Carter was happy with what he got to accomplish, the people he could help in his life. While sad over his grandfather's passing, Wenzel said Carter was accepting of death in the end. "He really believes he's going to heaven. He's going to be a better place. That really comforts me too," he said. Wenzel is one of Carter's 11 grandchildren and son of the late president's daughter Amy, who was one of the late president's primary caretakers in the end. Jimmy Carter leaves behind an enormous family, including 4 children, 11 grandkids, and 14 great-grandchildren. The 100-year-old 39th President of the United States married his wife, Rosalynn Smith, who died in November 2023 at 96, nearly 8 decades ago, in 1946, and they went on to welcome 3 sons and 1 daughter together. Each of Jimmy's kids, pictured above in 1979, have had numerous kids of their own, who have also had numerous kids of their own, resulting in him having a total of 29 descendants. While some of the former president's kids and grandkids have followed in Jimmy's footsteps and launched their own successful careers in politics, others tried and failed. They celebrated their 77th wedding anniversary in July 2023, but just 4 months later Rosalynn passed away peacefully with her family by her side. Ahead of her funeral, the Carter Center shared a touching poem penned by former President Jimmy Carter, pictured above with Rosalynn in 2018, to his beloved wife, which we will share below. Rosalynn by Jimmy Carter. She'd smile, and birds would feel that they no longer had to sing, or it may be I failed to hear their song. Within a crowd, I'd hope her glance might be for me, but I knew that she was shy and wished to be alone. I'd pay to sit behind her, blind to what was on the screen, and watch the image flicker upon her hair. I'd glow when her diminished voice would clear my muddled thoughts, like lightning flashing in a gloomy sky. The nothing in my soul with her aloof was changed to foolish fullness when she came to be with me. With shyness gone and hair caressed with gray, her smile still makes the birds forget to sing and me to hear their song. In 2023, Jimmy Carter attended the private funeral of his wife Rosalynn at the Maranatha Baptist Church where the family worshipped. The former president arrived in a wheelchair, wearing a red lei around his neck. He and other family members wore necklaces made of the Hawaiian flowers to honor Rosalynn Carter's love of Hawaii, where the Carters lived when Jimmy was in the Navy.